Yashodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Jamunatira Banachari Jamunatira Banachari Jayo Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jayo Radha Shama Sundarada Shama Sundarade Jayo Krishna Balaram Krishna Balaram Krishna Balaram Jayo Krishna Balaram Jayo Gauranitai 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 Jayo Gauranitai Jayo Jayo Prabhupada 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 Jayo Jayo Prabhupada
Jayam Vishnupad Paramahansa Paribrajakacharya Stotara Sata Shri Srimad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai Prem Sakho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shama Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Mayapur Dham Ki Jai, Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai, Srimati Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai, Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Samaveda Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Today we're continuing the reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, written by His Holiness Satsvarup Das Goswami. We're on chapter 9, entitled A Resident of Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada had just spent some time in Bombay with his first disciple, Acharya Prabhakar. Acharya Prabhakar had taken him to Kurukshetra, to the All India Sanskrit Conference, where Prabhupada was disappointed with the ramblings of the different speakers there. So he left the conference before it was over and returned to Vrindavan. When the conference had ended, Acharya Prabhakar joined Prabhupada in Vrindavan at his room at the Vansigopal temple, near the Radharaman temple. And they immediately began making plans how they could continue with their preaching work. Using the impressive new titles, these were titles that had been awarded to Prabhupada when he was lecturing in Bombay via the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Honorary Professor of Gita, Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, and Honorary Secretary of Hari Bhavan, Abai, with the assistance of Acharya Prabhakar, launched another attempt at rallying support for Back to Godhead and the League of Devotees. Within a few days, Acharya Prabhakar returned to his post in Bombay, and Abai was again alone in Vrindavan. He loved Vrindavan, yet with no means to publish and preach, he was not content there. If he were to travel, he might be able to enlist members for the League. He thought of Kanpur, which was nearby, a city of more than 100 big factories and many wealthy industrialists, some of whom he had met during his business travels. He decided to go. After printing some League of Devotee membership forms, he explained to Mahant Gopal that he would be away for a couple months. The Mahant was surprised. Although most elderly sadhus who came to Vrindavan stayed put, and some even took vows never to leave, this quiet Babu was coming and going constantly. Now, yes, Srila Prabhupada, he had a very good footing in Bombay at that time, and he met some very influential, pious and religious people. Because he was living there at Hari Bhavan, that's near Nariman Point and the Marine Drive area where the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan is. Many of the wealthy, pious families live there. For instance, at Malabar Hill, all those areas. And these were the places where Srila Prabhupada was giving his lectures, in the homes of these wealthy people. They were sponsoring and patronizing Srila Prabhupada at that time. Someone had given him a huge office space, and he had started an open university with courses. So he really did have a good rooting there. But after the conference at Kurukshetra, Prabhupada decided that he was not satisfied with the confinement of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan. And therefore he came back to Vrindavan, and Acharya Prabhakar didn't go right back to Bombay. He came to see Srila Prabhupada, and they discussed further how they could continue with the League of Devotees and make this Back to Godhead more popular. Now, Prabhupada was determined at that time not to return to Bombay. So he remembered, because Prabhupada had 3 different stages in Kanpur. Prabhupada considered Kanpur to be the most important city in the most important province of India. UP is the largest province in India. It used to be even larger, but then Uttaransha was cut off. And Prabhupada explains that there are 50 districts in UP. And that means there are 50 big cities. And UP is the most important province in all of India because of the holiness of the different cities there. He would tell all the different names: Allahabad, Agra, Mathura, Kanpur, Lucknow, and many of these places are prehistoric. They're religious, they're spiritual, all the different episodes that took place according to the Puranas and the Mahabharata. And Prabhupada would explain that even Kanpur, that whole area, including Kanpur, Farrukhabad, Kanauj, it was called Kanya Kubja. And that was where the pastime of Jamil took place. So these holy places along the bank of the 2 holy rivers, Jamuna and Ganga, Kanpur is nestled right on the Ganga there. We can see in the Shastras the spiritual value of these places. Now, in the present day, let's say the 1900s, when Prabhupada was living there in Kanpur, first in the late 40s, he went there as a pharmaceutical salesman because he had a flourishing business at that time. And Kanpur being the industrial center, and Prabhupada said that of all the cities in India, Calcutta, Bombay, and Kanpur were the most important. And he said Calcutta was a manufactured city. Nothing was there before. And then the British created Calcutta, making that as their capital. Bombay also was a manufactured city. There was nothing on that side either, and just due to financial and mercantile reasons, it was created. But Kanpur is a very ancient city, and it is so full of temples. Any little lane you go in, you'll find a Vishnu temple, a Shiva temple, a Radha Krishna temple, and he said even the Muslims there, they have their mosques everywhere. The people are highly religious there. And then he gave examples, because in 1947 he saw how the people lived, and he would also visit the temples. He said there was one temple there, and the mother of very, very wealthy industrialist, she was the mother in charge of the whole household, in charge of the whole family. She made a rule that every member of the family, her children, her grandchildren, whoever was connected with the family, they had to come for darshan every day to the temple. And if they didn't come to the temple, they would be fined. They would have to pay a 5 rupee fine, which was more money in those days. And the priest would come to their house and give them a slip of paper and says, "You've been fined, you have to pay your 5 rupees. So then Prabhupada told the devotees that we should start that also in our temples. That anyone who doesn't go to Mangalarti, they will be fined. And the fine will be, they have to distribute 1 Krishna book. So aside from that, Satsvarup Maharaj asked him at that time, he said, well, isn't Delhi an important city also? And Prabhupada said, no, it wasn't important. It was made important because it was the capital for political reasons, for government, international politics, things like that. Now they're trying to develop it industrially. And you can see they have the Okla and then Noida. That's new Okla industrial development area. They have all these areas. Now it's NRC. But actually Delhi was not considered an important city at that time. Kanpur was important. It's most important. Then Prabhupada explained that the further west you go, the more wealthy the cities are. So if you start over in Bengal and then you go to UP, he was saying that UP is the most important city, most important province, and also the wealthiest. And then he listed, in all the cities, Kanpur is the most important. So because Prabhupada had lived in the late 40s, he had lived there, he had sold his products there, and he already had acquaintances there. So he decided to go to Kanpur. Now, when Prabhupada, we'll read on and I'll tell you more about that. Abai preached actively in Kanpur, staying in various homes and canvassing for league members. As the guest of the Anandeshwar Satsang Mandal, he lectured regularly at the popular Parmat bathing ghat on the Ganges. He especially made acquaintances among industrialists and educators, often sitting and conversing with them for hours, and many were impressed by his dedication and his soft-spoken talks. But his collections were small. When he offered the wealthy magnates his constitutional membership, they usually opted in favor of the 2 rupees a year subscriber membership. He collected a few letters of appreciation, but after 2 months, he left. So this 2-month period, even then, he made so many important acquaintances that later played an important role in our development of ISKCON. For instance, if you read Prabhupada's letters, you'll read about Shri, or Sir. He was actually knighted by the English. Sir Padampat Singhania. So the Singhania family, they're Marwadis. They come from Singhana in the Jhunjhunu district in Rajasthan. And few generations back, nowadays we've all heard of Raymond Suiting, the Raymond Textiles. That's one of their many, many companies. JK Cement, JK Textile, JK everything. So JK was the father and grandfather of Padampat. It was Lala Junipat and Lala Kamlapat. So now there was Padampat Singhania. Very wealthy, they had their own temple, everything. His sons, they were so religious. His sons are named Gopal Krishna, Gaur Hari, Sham Hari, and Govinda Hari. So they were already devotees. And Prabhupada, it was as if Prabhupada was working on the eternal time factor. As much time as people would give him to explain the philosophy, and they were interested, because as devotees, they were devotees, how many people are willing to give freely spiritual knowledge? So Srila Prabhupada would not only meet with Padampat Singhania, but he would write letters they could be made into a book. They were so interesting about the power of mantra chanting, why it's so important, the Harinam, and how it can be canvassed in every single religion, and the reason that the difference between deductive and inductive research, and why deductive research is now being rejected because of fanaticism. Prabhupada would just give so much knowledge to Mr. Singhania, and this made a very close bond of relationship, spiritual relationship between the two of them. And that's just, we're just pinpointing one person. He had relations with the Tiwaris, another family who had a very big old temple there, with the Dawan family. And there were also Bengalis living in Kanpur. So, although Prabhupada at this time, as the preacher for League of Devotees and the distributor of Back to Godhead magazine, he only spent 2 months there. But he was able to make so many strong relationships that would later help us to develop ISKCON. So in 1977, 2 devotees went to Kanpur. And it was Atma Tattva and Ravi Das. We all remember Ravi Das. He was a preacher here. So they were distributing Back to Godhead magazines, and they noticed on one house, it had, the Bengali families. We've all heard of the Chatterjees, the Mukherjees, the Banerjees. So they knew from preaching in India, they saw the name Chatterjee. Oh, he's a Bengali, let's go see him. Maybe he'll take a Back to Godhead magazine. So they went to his office, and on the 3rd floor was his home, and he invited them to his home, Mr. Chatterjee. And when the devotees walked in, Mr. Chatterjee said, did you know that your Prabhupada lived here with us? This is where he sat, this is where he cooked. On the roof, he had his own clothesline, and no one would use that clothesline, only Prabhupada would use it. And I was in Arya Samaj at the time, Arya Samaji. Now the Arya Samajis, they have like 10 commandments, just like the Christians. The first commandment is one should worship God, but God is formless, God is it, God, you cannot, he is beginningless, endless, everything except for no form. You cannot, he has no beginning, no end, just like in the Upanishads explained, but he's formless, he's impersonal. They call God it. And then all the other principles of Arya Samaj is one should study the Vedas, so therefore they read the original Vedas, Rig Veda. They do yagya, they do agnihotras. They don't do any worship of any deity whatsoever because God is formless. And one should live a moral, honest life, helping mankind, like that. It's based on moral principles. So Mr. Chatterjee, he revealed and confided in Prabhupada that in public I'm an Arya Samaji. In private, I do my Panchopasana puja. That's Vishnu, Shiva, Parvati, Ganesh, and Surya. But honestly, I'm not happy with either. So Prabhupada, he spent 2 hours explaining to Mr. Chatterjee about the personal form of the Supreme Lord. And then, because Prabhupada was only there for 2 months, then he left. Years later, after Prabhupada had taken sannyas and printed his first volume of Srimad Bhagavatam, again Prabhupada was out preaching, this time as a sannyasi, and he went to Kanpur. And he went to Mr. Chatterjee's house, and he presented Mr. Chatterjee with his Srimad Bhagavatam, 1 volume. And he underlined in that Srimad Bhagavatam the key verses that describe the Supreme Lord as a person. And he gave that and he signed that. So when Mr. Chatterjee was talking to the devotees, he took that book out and he showed it to the devotees that this is what your Prabhupada gave me. And since that time, I went back to the worship that my forefathers did. And then he opened up the curtain and he showed them, you see, I'm worshiping Radha and Krishna now. And then he said, my little daughter, this is Prabhupada, he's so wonderful with children. She was just a little girl at that time. Prabhupada used to sit her on his lap and feed her his tomato rice. And he would tell her, don't listen to anything your father says. Just eat prasadam. So he said, my daughter is here now. She's come with her children for the holidays. So he called his daughter. And the daughter told the devotees that I was always an impersonalist. I was always a personalist. I never listened to what my father told me. So this is the heart-touching exchanges that Prabhupada had. He was not interested in big, doing something grand. Like he would say that there's so many spiritual leaders. They have a big name, they're very famous, but I wasn't like that. You know? I was just trying to make this pure, no compromise whatsoever, pure league of devotees, of Vaishnavas, trying to distribute this Back to Godhead magazine that had no compromise whatsoever in it. So, but Prabhupada would take all the time required with whomever he met to help them become Krishna conscious. It didn't matter who they were. So after these 2 months, we'll go on now. This Anandeshwar Satsang Mandal. So Anandeshwar, that is a Shiva Linga that's there. Now Karna, he used to do his puja at this place on the Ganga. And one day while Karna was doing his puja, a cow came, and at a particular place, she let all of her milk flow into the ground. And the owner of the cow, he couldn't understand why the cow did that, so he called the different neighbors, and they dug up that area, and they found this Swayambhu Shivaling. And because the cow's name was Anandi, they called it the Anandeshwar Shivaling. So that temple is very famous there in Kanpur, right on the bank of the Ganga, and there's a mandal there, there's a big area. So he lectured regularly at that, it's called the Parmat Bathing Ghat. And then Prabhupada also was looking, because he understood how important Kanpur was. Now, most of us, I didn't know this until I was studying Prabhupada's letters. The first temple that Prabhupada established in India when he came from the Pacific side, from Japan, then he came to Calcutta, he established at 3A Albert Road in Calcutta. He knew Calcutta was so important, and also he wanted to make his temple in Mayapur as well. Now, aside from the few devotees, when Prabhupada came here in 1967, Achyutananda followed soon after, because Achyutananda couldn't bear the separation from Prabhupada when Prabhupada came here with just Kirtanananda. So at that time, Prabhupada told Achyutananda to go to Kanpur and start a temple there. So Kanpur and another devotee, Jai Govinda, they went there and they were having a lot of success preaching to all the people who Prabhupada had cultivated, and also making a lot of very nice relations with people there. And there was one Mr. Banerjee. He offered them a big house. So Prabhupada, he wrote to Brahmananda, who was the temple president at 26 2nd Avenue then. He said, I want you to help Achyutananda. I want you to go there, Rai Ram, and Rupanuga. You should all go to Kanpur and help Achyutananda open this center because Kanpur is so important. And I want you to immediately send Achyutananda $100 from the book fund. And at that time, 1968, Prabhupada had 6 temples. He said, I want every temple to give $10, and next month you send $60 to Achyutananda. So Prabhupada's first concern, after, this was even before he had the Calcutta temple, he wanted a temple in Kanpur. He was always asking, finally we have a temple in Kanpur. So he was always asking the devotees to make this temple in Kanpur. There were many attempts here with the devotees. Akshayananda Swami, he would go there regularly. We had a lot of life members in Kanpur. And then Bhagavad Ashraya, he would go there. All of our life member directors would go to Kanpur. But not until just recently did we actually make a temple there. After some months in Vrindavan, so after Prabhupada left Kanpur, he returned to Vrindavan. After some months in Vrindavan, Abai decided to go back to Bombay and preach. In Bombay, he quickly broke off his association with the stifling Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and moved out of the faculty residence there. Staying a week at a time in the homes of various patrons, he tried to generate interest in his missionary activities. When a friend of Acharya Prabhakar arranged for Abai to address Sunday evening crowds at a Bombay beach, Abai accepted. Following already established custom, he sat on a cushion and the people gathered from 500 to 1,000, sitting and listening, as he loudly spoke the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. Abai spoke for several nights, and there were other lecture opportunities also. One week he spoke several times at a Bombay Vishnu temple. So this was all going on down in South Bombay. Now, later, when Prabhupada returned with the devotees in 1970, they all landed in Bombay, and Prabhupada had prearranged with all of these patrons who he was making now, and this is 1957, that they stay in different places there. And because Prabhupada was through Acharya Prabhakar, he knew Mr. Chokshi, and Mr. Chokshi was one of the officers of the Scindia steamship run by Sumati Morarji. So Mr. Chokshi, even at this time, had promised Prabhupada that you just get your passport, you get your no objection, and I will put you on a steamship to America. So this is 57. Finally, when Prabhupada did come back in 1970, now, in between that time, Prabhupada finally met Sumati Morarji. And most of the people lived in South Bombay then. But the very wealthy people, they lived in a place called Juhu. And that was where Sumati Morarji lived. And that was where all the movie stars lived, because it was out of the city and they wanted to be away from the crowds. So they had their villas and everything out in a place called Juhu, which was, if you went to Juhu then, it was just a little fishing town. But they had all their beautiful houses there. So when Prabhupada finally, through Mr. Chokshi, had his appointment with Sumati Morarji, and then she was helping him to print the Srimad Bhagavatam, he would go regularly and read the Srimad Bhagavatam to Sumati Murarji at her home in Juhu. And as he was walking to her house, he would see on this side of the road, there was just one road in Juhu, this beautiful jungle area. And he would always be thinking, if I could make a temple there, it would be so perfect. I would make a beautiful Radha Krishna temple. So as he walked, because Sumati Murarji's house was just 2 blocks away from where our Juhu temple is now. So at that time, he made a secret promise to Krishna, that Krishna, if I could get this land, I will make a beautiful temple for you. From that time even. So all of this preaching that Prabhupada was doing, although it seems like he wasn't making any real success, because they just weren't interested in becoming full-time Vaishnavas, he was planting roots there. The roots were moving, and he was making relationships with all these people. And when Prabhupada, when he brought all the devotees, 40 devotees, and they were in South Bombay, when he told these people that now we're going to make a temple in Juhu, they were completely opposed to it. They made a delegation that nobody goes to Juhu. We won't go to Juhu. We are your supporting members. We're the people who want to build a temple, and we want you to build a temple here where we live. We don't want a temple in Juhu. So this whole delegation went to try to convince Prabhupada not to make a temple in Juhu. But because Prabhupada had made that promise to Krishna at that time, he was determined to get that land and make the temple there, despite the wishes of his supporting members. And he did it. And they all came out to Juhu. But Abai wanted to do more than deliver occasional lectures to uncommitted audiences. The conviction was growing within him that he should preach outside India. The idea, of course, had been there for some time. He had expressed it in his prospectus for the League of Devotees, before gatherings at the Radha Memorial in Jhansi, during his meeting at the Birla Mandir in Delhi, and on many other occasions. Informally, he had expressed it hundreds of times to acquaintances, and he had woven his dream throughout his writings. Now, interestingly, when Achyutananda and Jai Govinda were in Kanpur, and Prabhupada had Brahmananda send him the $100, it turned out, Prabhupada found out, that Mr. Banerjee was a con man. And the $100 never reached Achyutananda, it got lost. And then Prabhupada, he sent $100 to the Radha Damodar temple, to the Sevites. That also got lost. And then he sent $300 to the printer, Heat Sharan. $100 of that also got lost. But then when Achyutananda wrote to him that actually Mr. Banerjee, he stole our 2 typewriters, and the beautiful house that he was promising us was all fictitious. So then Prabhupada, he wrote to Brahmananda explaining all this, that now I fully realize my spiritual master is inspiring me through all these losses, that I should not try to make a temple in India at all. This is 1968. That I should concentrate here in America. Now, Prabhupada's plan for planting Achyutananda and Jai Govinda in Kanpur was, he told them this. He says, we are aiming for the Indian youngsters because the American devotees will convince the Indian youngsters to become devotees like them. Prabhupada always had this psychological understanding that the youth of India, when they see American devotees, they will want to become devotees also. But then when he saw that these young, inexperienced devotees in India were just being cheated by the con man, he told them, leave Kanpur, forget it. Don't try to, we're not going to try to make any temple right now in India, 1968. It wasn't until 1970 that Prabhupada had success there. So now Prabhupada, he realized even when he came back to Bombay, that just by giving lectures to uncommitted audiences, he wasn't going to get much result. He needed committed people. And at this point, he only had one disciple. He was ready to travel anywhere if he could fulfill Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's order to preach in English. In India, the English-speaking population was small. So Abai continued to dream of going to the West. If he could travel to Bombay, Delhi, and Kanpur, why not to London or New York, where millions spoke English and had never heard the message of Lord Chaitanya? Writing to Mr. Ved Prakash, a Kanpur industrialist, Abai explained his idea. Now, these letters that Prabhupada, remember, we didn't have there wasn't even electricity. Prabhupada would hand type all these letters, and they would be pages and pages long. So I'll read a paragraph at a time of this long letter. Lord Chaitanya said, Praminam upakaraya, i.e., to say for the benefit of all living being concerned. While rendering first aid service in the battlefield, the Red Cross men, although equally disposed to all the wounded soldiers, they give first preference to the hopeful ones. The hopeless ones are sometimes neglected. In India, even after the attainment of Swaraj, the mentality is predominant by made in London ideas. It is a long story, but in a nutshell, the leaders of India, in the name of secular government, they have engaged themselves in everything foreign. They have carefully set aside the treasure house of India's spiritual asset, and they are imitating the westernized material way of life, constantly engaged in the acts of error of judgment, misgivings, imperfectness, and duplicity. Now, Prabhupada once explained this made in London concept to us. We had gone to Prabhupada to give him a report of our book distribution, the library party. We had met up with Prabhupada coming from the south. We came to Mayapur to meet Prabhupada. And something inspired Prabhupada to discuss this made in London idea. He said that previously, if you needed a knife, you would go to one of these smithies on the road, and he would make a knife for you, and that knife would last your whole lifetime. But now, with the influence of the Western industrialization, they have opened up factories. And those factories produce thousands and thousands of knives. And those knives, they'll last for 1 year and then they'll break. Because if the knife doesn't break, then it's the end of their business. So they have to make the knife so that it has just a limited lifespan. And what they do is, whatever they make, they print made in UK, made in Germany, like that. Because the Indian mentality from the subjugation of the Britishers is that if it's made in India, it means it's inferior quality. And if it's made in the West, then it's superior quality. Just like with the cotton mills. Before, people just wore khadi. That means that it would be hand woven, and there were no textile mills anywhere in India. But what the British did was they took all the cotton from the farmers, they shipped it to UK, And on their electric mills, they made this very fine cotton, what we're all wearing today. Nobody wears khadi anymore. And it was very light and very evenly milled. So the people, and then they would bring that cotton back to India and sell it here at a high price. So it was the Indian cotton taken to England and then brought back here to sell. And the Indian people considered it superior, although the Brahmins would never wear it, and they weren't allowed to do puja in it, nothing like that. But the people in general, it was just understood that anything that came from outside of India was superior quality. And therefore the medicines, like Nehru, Prabhupada would say, Nehru, when he would come to his Prayag pharmacy, he wouldn't buy Deshi medicine, he would only buy the Western medicine. So that's why in 1947, when Gandhi, after they had made the Constitution, and by the way, Mr. Singhania, he was one of the signers on the Constitution. That's how high up he was in both English and Indian politics. But he wasn't a politician, he was just a very wealthy industrialist. So Gandhi, although he had all of these principles of homemade, agrarian life, following the principles of Bhagavad Gita, Hindu and Muslims living side by side, his disciples, Nehru, Patel, everyone, they rejected all of those principles and they started secularism. And that's what this secularism is. In a long, long letter that Prabhupada wrote to Mr. Singhania, he explained that this secularism is the product of people following too fanatically their religious texts. He said, because he gave the example that in the Vedas, bone is considered impure, but the conch shell is considered pure. And even in the deity room, they have the conch shell. If you scientifically analyze a conch shell and any bone, it's the same materials. Everything is the same chemically. But because the Vedas say the conch shell is pure, therefore it's blindly accepted that the conch shell is pure. But when the Muslims take the bone of an ox and throw it into a temple, then there's a huge riot, and as a result of that, now there's partition. That's because the Hindus are following very strictly, and the Muslims are following very strictly, and they can't concede to live peacefully together. He said that's the cause of jihadism, that's the cause of the crusades of the Christians, because they're fanatically following their scriptures. So the rejection of that fanaticism is secularism, that we don't allow the mixing of religion with government. And therefore, the followers of Gandhi rejected his principles and adopted this secularism. And that's why they were looking towards the West, because in the West, the religion and the government are kept separate. India's Vedic knowledge is above all the conditional defects mentioned above. But we Indians at the present moment have neglected such wonderful Vedic knowledge. It is due to its improper handling. This Vedanta Sutra is presented in India by unauthorized persons of different camps, and as such the people are being misguided. Newly sprung up national enthusiasm of the Indian leaders, industrialists, and plan makers has no time, neither desire to understand the message of Vedanta Sutra or even the Bhagavad Gita. You cannot do acts of humanity without proper guidance. Now again, we go back to Kanpur. When Prabhupada was there in 1947, that was the time when Prabhupada wrote his letter to Mahatma Gandhi and told him exactly the same thing. He said, you are preaching Bhagavad Gita, but actually you never studied Bhagavad Gita. Gandhi himself in his biography, his autobiography, said that when he went to England to study, and they had some Vedanta organization there, they asked him to teach them about Bhagavad Gita. He had never read Bhagavad Gita in his life at that time. And it was only when he went to England that he was forced to read Bhagavad Gita, because these people wanted to learn what Bhagavad Gita was. And he had to translate for them. So it's a fact that the Indians did not understand their own culture. And Prabhupada, in his letter, this last letter just 2 months before he died, he was assassinated, Prabhupada said, just take 1 month off and let us sit together, and I will teach you the proper principles of Bhagavad Gita. Of course, Prabhupada said, or at least Satsru Maharaj said in the Lilamrita, that Prabhupada probably, Gandhi never even saw the letter. And then after that he died. So Prabhupada he would write to anyone he could, amongst the officers, amongst the spiritualists, amongst the authors. There was one other writer, he wrote a book called Religion of Love. So Prabhupada, of course, we follow the religion of love, and that's Lord Chaitanya's teachings. But this author, he just wrote his own book from his own mental speculation without any consideration of what's in the Shastras, nothing. So Prabhupada said, you're writing, but you're writing one book, another person will write another book. It has to be on some type of authority coming from the Supreme Lord before you make your own religion like this. So the man rejected what Prabhupada said, of course. So this is what Prabhupada's trying to explain. And remember, he's writing to a Kanpur industrialist, all of this. So my idea of preaching in the foreign countries means that they are rather fed up with material advancement of knowledge. They are seeking the message guidance of the Vedanta Sutra, or for the matter of the Bhagavad Gita, in an authorized way. And I am sure that India will again go back to the spiritual life when the principle is accepted by the Europeans, Americans, etc., because the Indian people are now in the habit of begging after neglecting their own property. That was my viewpoint. But all the same, we must take only the opportunity of service. Now, in another very long letter that Prabhupada wrote to Mr. Singhania, this is all before Prabhupada went to America, he explained that you are a very successful industrialist, and you know the importance of sociology, how to engage men, and how to engage capital, that means money, and how to, because the JK industrialists, they're all over India, billions, I mean beyond crores, we can't even imagine what their different companies are worth. So they're very successful at organization. So Prabhupada was explaining to Mr. Singhania that just as you have been so successful in industrial organization, we have to use that same success in this spiritual organization of the League of Devotees. So Prabhupada was trying to take all of the acumen of the successful industrialists and use that to build a strong spiritual movement and Prabhupada was able to do that. He was so successful when he met an ambassador and was explaining to the ambassador of India that we were having trouble getting the exchange, the government wouldn't allow us to take any money out of India. The government only gave me permission to receive donations from Indians outside of India. So, but the Indians, they go outside of India, they're not interested in their own culture, that's why they leave India. So he said no Indians were willing to help me out who lived outside of India. I had to take help from my young boys and girls, my students. And some of them, like, and he gave the name of George Harrison, speaking to this ambassador, he said, George Harrison, he's just given me a house that's worth 55 lakhs. It was 220,000 pounds. Very, very, that's the Bhaktivedanta manor that we have. So Prabhupada wasn't able to get any help from the Indians outside of India. And even when Prabhupada wrote to Mr. Singhania from New York, he saw a beautiful building there. We'll hear about this later. Mr. Singhania was welcome to help him, but the government wouldn't let him send any money out of India. They were so strict, the Reserve Bank of India. And Mr. Singhania, before the government refused, he said, you want to purchase you want to get one building with 3 floors, but if I'm going to build a temple, I'm going to send my own architects. It's going to be a first-class temple, and it's going to be all according to the Vedic architecture. I'm going to do it on my terms if you want me to build a temple. So he was willing to do it. He wanted to do it, but the government wouldn't allow him to do it because they wouldn't let any money out of India. So some people with Prabhupada's, just like this, spending so much time writing to Mr. Ved Prakash, cultivating them on their terms, because Prabhupada had also been a successful businessman. He knew how to make a successful business. So they listened to him, and eventually they did help him. One way of expanding his way of preaching was to mail copies of Back to Godhead outside India. I don't know what time it is. How much time do we have? 5 minutes, okay. Was to mail copies of Back to Godhead outside India. And as an incentive for enlisting donors, he made it known that the donor's name would be printed on each copy. His ambition was to bring in large donations, run large printings, and send Back to Godhead to more than 50 countries. He assigned quotas. America would receive 10,000 copies, Argentina 500, Belgium 500, Brazil 500, Burma 1,000, Canada 500, Chile 500, China 10,000, and so on, including 10,000 for Russia and 10,000 for England. But the donors and donations never appeared, and the plans for Back to Godhead were never realized. Not now, they weren't realized at this point, but simply because Prabhupada wished these things and dreamed in these things, as we heard last week. Nothing happens by chance. That Super Soul, he's listening to our desires, and he gives sanction. When we want to do something for him, yes, he gives the sanction. So Prabhupada, he was writing all these places, and every single place that Prabhupada wrote, there are now temples where thousands upon thousands of Back to Godhead magazines and books are being distributed. So here was the seed planting, the dreaming state, thinking, feeling, and willing. Prabhupada had it all planned out before he got on that boat to come to America. All of these countries he visited, and eventually the Back to Godhead magazine was put in all these places beyond the 500 and the 10,000 that Prabhupada was at this time imagining. Now it's hundreds of thousands of lakhs of books. When we can't even, Gopal Krishna once said, pick a number. You can't even estimate how many books and magazines the Krishna Consciousness Society has distributed all throughout the world. 87 languages we have now, Prabhupada's books. We'll be making here we have a small display, but for the TOVP, we're going to make a huge display of all those books because they have the room there. Everything's magnanimous there. Here everything is small and sweet in Vrindavan. So they've already given permission. And we're going to have a big display there of all the books in all the languages. Jai. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna.